Let's begin with Story 1. Story 1. The Kingdom of Ghana, where salt was gold and gold was salt. You might imagine gold kingdoms as glittering courts, filled with jeweled crowns and carved thrones. But in the heart of West Africa, where the Sahel met the endless Sahara, the true currency was dust made of salt, dust made of sand, dust that glittered when the sun struck it just right. The ancient kingdom of Ghana, known to its neighbors as Wagadu, rose from this dust sometime before the year 700 CE, and for centuries it stood as one of the most organized, quietly powerful states in early African history. It was not a kingdom of storytellers, though stories were told. It was a kingdom of counters of caravans and camels, of scales and silent agreements made in the dry heat. For the people of Ghana, the most precious sound was not music or prayer, but the clinking of salt against iron, of gold against weight stones. The landscape of balance. Ghana's world was one of balance. The north was dry and pale, the south green and damp. Between them lay a fragile belt of life, the Sahel, where millet grew thinly in the dust, and where the early kings of Ghana built their first settlements near what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali. To the north lay salt, vast slabs hewn from places like Tagheza and Taoudeni. To the south, deep within the forests, glimmered veins of gold near the Bambuk and Bure fields. Ghana stood between them, quietly taking its share from both. The people who built Ghana called themselves the Soninke. They were farmers and traders, their days filled with the rhythm of tending small plots and watching the skies for rain that rarely came. But they were also survivors of an older world, one that had endured the collapse of desert rains and the drift of migrating herds. Over generations, they learned to read the dunes like a ledger. They built wells, dug channels, and recorded debts in the minds of griots, oral historians who kept numbers through stories, and stories through numbers. Kings of the Middle. By the time Arab writers first mentioned Ghana around the 9th century, the kingdom was already old. To outsiders, it seemed an empire of quiet wealth, ruled by kings so rich that their dogs wore collars of gold. The capital, Kumbai Sale, was described by travelers like al-Bakri as two cities in one for the king, another for Muslim merchants who came from the north. This duality defined Ghana. The king presided over rituals that were ancient and local, surrounded by drums, iron weapons, and fetishes of wood and clay. Yet only a short distance away, in the traders' quarter, men from North Africa built mosques and prayed toward Mecca. Between them lay the invisible frontier of trade, a place where faiths met but rarely spoke, where transactions were made not in words but in trust. The Soninke rulers understood the mathematics of silence. They taxed every load of salt that entered from the north, and every ounce of gold dust that left to the south. This simple equation made them powerful without ever lifting a sword. They did not mine the gold, they did not dig the salt. They stood between them, and like a calm tide, wealth flowed through their hands. The ritual of trade. Imagine for a moment the ritual itself. At a lonely clearing near the Niger's edge, two groups would meet but never see each other. One group, northern Berber traders, would arrive first, laying their slabs of salt upon the sand, perhaps leaving copper or cloth beside them. Then they would retreat, building small fires to signal that their offer was ready. Later, the forest traders would appear, often silent, placing small piles of gold dust beside each salt slab. They too would retreat. If the Berbers were satisfied, they would take the gold and depart, leaving the salt behind. If not, they would wait for more gold to be added. This silent barter, though slow, was astonishingly effective. It preserved peace in a region where languages differed and trust was fragile. It also embodied Ghana's spirit, measured, deliberate, and dignified. The administration of stillness. At its height, Ghana was not a vast empire of conquest but a carefully tended network of vassal towns. Each paid tribute to the king, who sat in solemn audience surrounded by gold and ivory. Al-Bakri wrote that when the king appeared, drums and horns announced him, and subjects prostrated themselves, sprinkling dust upon their heads, a symbol of humility before the earth that sustained them. The king's court kept order through appointed officials, interpreters, treasurers, and commanders of soldiers who rode horses brought from the north. Horses were rare in the Sahel. They were fed on imported grain and reserved for war. To see a mounted soldier in Ghana was to glimpse wealth embodied. But daily life was slow. The bureaucracy of Ghana moved like the desert wind, soft, almost invisible, but constant. Merchants paid taxes in gold dust weighed on simple scales. Judges settled disputes with calm logic and ritual oaths. Traders slept beneath woven mats, dreaming of caravans yet to arrive. The flow of salt. Salt, though it glittered less than gold, mattered more. In the heat of the Sahel, salt preserved life. It kept meat edible, replaced sweat lost to the sun, and served as medicine. It was said that a slab of salt could buy a man's freedom or ransom a caravan. From the mines of Tagheza, men worked in unbearable heat, cutting great gray blocks from the crusted earth. They lived among ghosts, salt everywhere, food scarce, water bitter. Camels carried these blocks north and south, their footprints fading almost as soon as they were made. In Ghana's markets, the exchange rate between salt and gold was a delicate art. 1 ounce of gold might equal 1 ounce of salt, or more, depending on the season. Merchants watched the skies for dust storms, knowing that a single week of disrupted travel could shift fortunes. For the Soninke rulers, every caravan was a moving vein of wealth, and every slab of salt a small tribute to their authority. The edges of the desert. Beyond the northern dunes lay Berber lands, tied to North African cities like Sijil Massa and Oudacust. From these came not only salt, but also Islam, a new rhythm of prayer, trade, and written law. At first, Ghana's kings tolerated this without joining it. They saw Islam as the religion of merchants, useful but foreign. Yet over time, the Arabic script became the language of record-keeping, and the camel caravans became lifelines of communication with the Mediterranean world. Through these networks, Ghana's gold reached the markets of Cairo, Kairouan, and even Baghdad, where it gleamed on the wrists of caliphs and adorned the domes of mosques. And yet in Ghana itself, life remained quiet, measured, almost monotonous, a civilization built not on conquest or invention, but on the steady rhythm of exchange. The silence before the shift. But silence, like the desert, is never permanent. By the 11th century, the balance that had sustained Ghana began to shift. To the north, Berber confederations such as the Almoravids rose with the zeal of new faith and new ambition. They sought not only trade but conversion. To the south, new goldfields were discovered, drawing merchants away from Ghana's controlled routes. And within, the rhythm of the old Soninke order began to falter under the weight of its own success. The caravans still came, but fewer each year. The king's court still shone, but its gold bought less. In the capital, the hum of the markets continued, but whispers grew about new routes, new alliances, and the strange preachers who spoke of one God instead of many. The weight of dust revisited. As the sun set over the Sahel, the air filled with the smell of dry grass and camel sweat. Traders packed their loads and counted their profits. The king's guards lit torches along the palace walls. Somewhere in the distance, a griot rehearsed the lineage of kings, his voice slow and even, as if time itself were a circle rather than a line. In that moment, Ghana still stood the mediator between salt and gold, between desert and forest, between belief and silence. Yet even as its markets buzzed, unseen forces were moving beyond the horizon. How long could a kingdom built on balance survive, when every side of that balance began to shift? And what happened to the people who measured their lives not in years, but in caravans? The fall of a kingdom rarely begins with a bang. In Ghana's case, it began with a quiet shift in the dunes, the slow drying of a well, the missing of a single caravan. When historians later tried to pinpoint the exact moment the kingdom began to collapse, they found only patterns. No battles carved into stone, no declarations of war. Just the slow unwinding of trade routes, the flickering of alliances, the quiet erosion of influence. Yet within that silence, changes were stirring. The arrival of the Almoravids. To the north, the Sahara was not only a desert but a moving sea of ideas. Among the Berber tribes, a religious reform movement was taking shape. The Almoravids, born from the Sanhaja Confederation, had begun to preach a stricter form of Islam, one based on discipline, reform, and the purging of syncretism. Their leader, Abdallah ibn Yassin, was not a general at first but a preacher. By the mid-11th century, his influence had grown, and his followers were no longer simply traders and missionaries, but soldiers and conquerors. The Almoravids swept southward not with grand armies, but with the quiet intensity of zeal. Their target was not Ghana directly, but the trade networks it controlled. The city of Otaghust, long under Ghana's sphere, fell to the Almoravids around 1054 CE. With it, Ghana lost a critical node in its northern trade system. Otaghust had been more than a city, it was a fulcrum. Its markets buzzed with goods from Morocco and gold from the forest belt. When it changed hands, it sent tremors down the spine of Ghana's trade economy. And yet within Ghana itself, life continued. The caravans still arrived. The taxes were still collected. But something had shifted, almost imperceptibly. Islam and the inner court. Within Ghana's capital, Kumbai Sale, the influence of Islam grew not by conquest but by proximity. The king remained, devoted to the older rituals of the Saninke. His court maintained the customs of ancestors, animal sacrifices, ancestral veneration, the use of charms and fetishes. But in the merchant city just a few hundred meters away, mosques rose from the dust, and the daily calls to prayer marked the passage of time. The two worlds coexisted for a while. Yet some of the king's advisors, educated in Arabic and trained in Islamic law, began to whisper of new ways. They brought new ideas for taxation, record-keeping, diplomacy. They also brought discontent, for the traditional priesthood saw its authority quietly eroded by men who spoke a foreign tongue and answered to a distant god. This tension remained mostly hidden. No civil war broke out, no revolution unfurled. But every tension accumulates pressure. Some historians believe that part of the Almoravid motivation to press southward was to assist fellow Muslims within Ghana's elite. Whether or not this was true, it became a justification for further Almoravid campaigns. The mystery of 1076. In the year 1076, according to some Arabic chroniclers, the Almoravids captured Kumbai Sale. What exactly happened remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest a full military conquest. Others describe more of a temporary occupation or alliance. What is clear is that the balance shifted decisively. If the Almoravids controlled Ghana, even for a short time, it would have disrupted the careful neutrality that had allowed Ghana to flourish. Suddenly, the middleman was no longer neutral. If Ghana now tilted toward Islam, would the southern gold producers continue their trust? If Ghana fell under foreign rule, would the northern traders still pay tax? The networks began to fray. Fragmentation from within. Even after the Almoravid presence waned by 1087 CE, they had largely withdrawn. The damage had been done. The Saninke elite, already weakened by internal tensions, could not rebuild the old networks. New goldfields farther south, such as Wangara, came into play. And with them, new trade routes emerged, routes that bypassed Ghana entirely. Smaller kingdoms and chiefdoms, once vassals of Ghana, sensed opportunity. They began to assert autonomy. Cities that had once paid tribute now hoarded their wealth. This fragmentation wasn't sudden. It took decades. But by the early 1100s, Ghana was no longer an empire. It was a memory stitched together by griots. Yet the capital did not burn. There were no widespread massacres, no grand exodus. The markets shrank. The caravans thinned. The tax collectors arrived late or not at all. In many ways, Ghana collapsed as it had risen quietly, with the rhythm of the desert. The rise of new powers. The vacuum left by Ghana's decline did not remain empty for long. To the east, a new power was rising, Mali. Led by the Mandinka people, and eventually shaped by a king named Sundiata, Mali would inherit much of Ghana's trade infrastructure and then surpass it. Mali learned from Ghana's strength, the value of controlling trade rather than production. But Mali also learned from Ghana's mistakes. It built a more centralized military, promoted Islam more explicitly, and connected itself more firmly to the wider Islamic world. By the early 13th century, Ghana was no longer mentioned in trade records. It appeared only in the oral epics, as the place where gold once flowed like dust and where kings taxed silence itself. Life among the remnants. But while historians speak of collapse, people lived on. The Soninke did not vanish. They continued to farm, to trade, to build. The cities shrank, but they did not disappear. Local chiefs replaced kings. Markets became smaller but more locally controlled. The same paths that once hosted camels with salt slabs now saw donkeys with kola nuts, or traders with beads and textiles. The volume changed, the rhythm remained. In these smaller towns, life became more personal. Griots told stories not just of empires, but of families, of how a trader's great-grandfather once traveled to Kumbai Sale, and how his children later served the new kings of Mali. In this way, the legacy of Ghana was preserved not in books, but in voices. A kingdom without ruins. Unlike the stone cities of Great Zimbabwe or the coral houses of the Swahili coast, Ghana left behind almost no ruins. The Sahel is not kind to memory. Mud brick melts, wood rots, wind buries all. What remains of Ghana exists in layers of sand, a few scattered foundations, and the stubborn memory of names passed down through centuries. Archaeologists have found pottery, hearths, and remnants of iron tools near the suspected site of Kumbai Sale. They suggest a large urban settlement, possibly home to tens of thousands. But without stone, there are no monuments. This absence of visible legacy has made some historians overlook Ghana. But its true legacy lies elsewhere, in systems of trade, in methods of taxation, in the very idea of a middle kingdom that shaped vast regional economies through balance, rather than force. The silence of gold. Ghana's fall teaches us something unusual in history, that an empire can rise, thrive, and fall without ever raising a vast army, without building pyramids, and without carving laws into stone. Its influence was real but quiet. It turned salt into currency, and silence into diplomacy. And when it disappeared, it did so without panic. It faded into the memory of merchants, into the mutterings of griots, into the calculations of future empires who borrowed its methods. In the end, the most valuable things Ghana traded were not gold or salt. They were stability, trust, and time. And perhaps that's why its story is so easily forgotten, because Ghana's greatest achievement was not in what it built, but in what it balanced. But one final question lingers. What happened to Kumbai Sale, once a city of thousands, where kings ruled from golden thrones? Did its people stay, or did they follow the caravans to newer lands? And if they stayed, what became of the city when the gold stopped flowing? As the heat of the day faded, and the sun dipped behind the line of low hills that once watched over Kumbai Sale, a silence settled over the earth. It is the kind of silence not born of absence, but of long memory, the silence of a place that once mattered to the world in ways few now recall. In this final part of Ghana's story, we will travel into the afterlife of an empire, through the remains left behind in the soil, the subtle transformations in its people's culture, and the deep legacy it carried silently into the future of West Africa. What happened to the city that once stood at the crossroads of salt and gold? The forgotten capital. When Arab geographer al-Bakri wrote of Kumbai Sale in the 11th century, he described a place of unusual size and organization. One part of the city was inhabited by local Soninke people home to the royal palace, the drum corps, and the court that issued decisions over trade and tribute. The other was a Muslim settlement of North African merchants and scholars, home to 12 mosques, including one for Friday prayers, imams, and judges trained in Islamic jurisprudence. He claimed that the two communities were separated by a few hundred meters, a physical division of religion and role. In reality, the lines were likely more blurred. Merchants and rulers shared interests even if they prayed to different gods. When the trade routes shifted and the kingdom's central authority waned, Kumbai Sale's life did not end abruptly. Cities rarely die in explosions. They diminish, lose relevance, and are eventually abandoned not all at once, but in layers. Some inhabitants likely moved to newer trade centers further south. Others remained, adapting to smaller markets and local needs. The city shrank, its northern section gradually abandoned as merchants relocated to more vibrant crossroads like Djenné or Timbuktu. Yet its southern sector, closer to the heart of Soninke power, may have persisted for another generation or more. Today, the site believed to be Kumbai Sale lies in southeastern Mauritania, near the Malian border. Archaeological digs since the 20th century have uncovered the traces of a large settlement, clay foundations, pottery shards, remnants of iron tools, and items that hint at cross-Saharan trade. But there are no grand ruins, no stone walls, no palaces. The materials of Ghana's capital, mud, wood, woven straw, were the materials of pragmatism, not permanence. They served a kingdom of traders, not builders of empire in the Roman or Egyptian sense. Kumbai Sale, once a capital of quiet precision, disappeared not in fire but in erosion. The Soninke legacy. The Soninke people, founders and rulers of Ghana, did not vanish with their kingdom. After the collapse of centralized power, they continued to live in the region, adapting, trading, farming, and remembering. In fact, the Soninke remain a distinct ethnic group to this day, spread across Mauritania, Senegal, Mali, and the Gambia. Their language, Soninke or Maraka, is still spoken, and in oral traditions they recount the story of Wagadu, the name they used for the ancient Ghana Empire. In Soninke folklore, Ghana is remembered not just as a political state, but as a mythic memory, a land of balance, of gold and dust, of sacred rituals and lost cities. The griot still tells stories of Dinga Sis, the legendary founder of the dynasty, and of a time when salt brought riches, and gold lost its meaning because it was so abundant. Their continued survival and preservation of oral traditions makes the Soninke one of the rare direct cultural bridges between ancient empire and modern memory in West Africa. Trade never sleeps. Even after Ghana's decline, the networks it helped formalize remained active. The routes across the Sahara endured. Salt still moved from the mines at Tagheza and Taoudeni to the forest zones. Gold continued to rise from the riverbanks of the Niger and the Volta. Slaves, cola nuts, cloth, copper, and cowries formed the arteries of an expanding system of commerce. What changed was the center of gravity. The Mali Empire, rising in the 13th century under Sundiata Keita, took many of Ghana's systems and reshaped them. Timbuktu became the new center of learning. Niani and Gao rose to prominence. Caravans grew in size, and under Mali's later Emperor Mansa Musa, gold reached European markets at unprecedented levels. But the roots of that system, standardized weights, taxation points, regulated trade posts, mutual protection for caravans, were all pioneered under Ghana. It created a template for economic statecraft that others would follow. And this template extended far beyond its borders. As the Hausa city-states emerged in the east and Benin and Oyo took shape in the south, Ghana's model, tax the trade, don't dominate the source, remained relevant. Islam's quiet advance. While Ghana's kings never officially converted to Islam, the religion spread steadily during and after the empire's decline. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Islam had become the dominant religion among traders, scribes, and much of the elite in the Sahel. Arabic became the language of record-keeping. Quranic schools began to flourish. Judges used Islamic law in trade disputes, and architecture, though still largely absent from stone, began to show Sudano-Sahelian influences, with timber beams and mud brick construction methods inspired by northern styles. Islam was not imposed in Ghana. It was absorbed, like salt into stew, silently but completely. This fusion would culminate later in the Mali and Songhai empires, but its roots are visible in the late Ghanaian period, especially in its northern merchant communities. Ghana, in this way, was not just a mediator of goods, but a conduit of ideas, bridging forest and desert, traditional religion and Islam, oral memory and written record. Echoes in modern borders. Though Ghana as a political entity disappeared, its name lived on. When Kwame Nkrumah led the Gold Coast to independence from Britain in 1957, he chose the name Ghana for the new nation. Why? Because although the medieval Ghana Empire was geographically located further north, largely in present-day Mauritania, and Mali, the idea of Ghana symbolized African self-sufficiency, dignity, and historic achievement. Nkrumah's Ghana sought to reclaim that legacy not literally, but symbolically. To remind Africans and the world that long before colonial maps were drawn, complex and powerful civilizations thrived on African soil. The name was a statement, a reclaiming of pride. And though the two Ghanas are not the same, the echo is powerful. Reflections in the dust. In the end, Ghana's story resists spectacle. There are no towering ruins or dramatic chronicles. Its greatness lay in the quiet mastery of logistics, the art of neutrality, the governance of trade. It succeeded not by dominating its neighbors, but by understanding their needs. It did not control gold mines or salt quarries directly. It positioned itself at the intersection of desire and access, and took its share without overreaching. It collapsed not from invasion alone, but from a shifting world it no longer controlled. And perhaps that is the most human thing about Ghana's story. The idea that even the best designed systems must change when the world around them changes. Its legacy lies not in stone, but in rhythm. The rhythm of caravans across the sand. The rhythm of griots reciting names by firelight. The rhythm of exchange, the invisible pulse that once tied forest to desert, salt to gold, and story to silence. So the next time you hear the word Ghana, let your mind drift not to ruins or relics, but to a lonely outpost where two traders once faced each other across a patch of sand, never speaking, yet understanding exactly what needed to be done. A kingdom of silence. A kingdom of balance. A kingdom of dust and gold. Story 2. Mali's silent caravans and the sands that whispered wealth. If Ghana was the quiet architect of West African trade, then Mali was its resounding echo, deeper, more structured, and altogether more visible to the world. You may have heard of Mansa Musa, the emperor so wealthy that he reportedly collapsed the economies of entire cities by spending too much gold. But Mali was not born with a golden scepter in its hand. It rose slowly, layered over old paths, crafted by those who remembered Ghana not as a fallen empire, but as a model to surpass. And at the heart of it all were the caravan's long, silent processions of camels bearing salt, cloth, and gold, threading their way through the sands like needle and thread across time. A landscape older than empires. The Sahel region of West Africa, a narrow band between the dense forests of the south and the vast Sahara to the north, is a place of quiet endurance. Here, land is shaped by wind more than by water, and people have always had to move not far, but cleverly. In this transitional zone, power came not from castles or armies, but from knowledge of space and rhythm when the rains would come, where the grass would regrow, how far a camel could go without collapsing. These were facts remembered not on parchment, but in muscle, in bone, and in the songs of griots. When the Ghana Empire faltered, the Sahel did not fall into chaos. It breath contracted for a moment, then began expanding again in a different direction. The Mandinka and the foundations of Mali. To the south of Ghana's former core lived a people known as the Mandinka, part of the larger Mande-speaking group. For generations, they had lived in decentralized societies, ruled by local chiefs and guided by ancestral traditions. But they were also tied together by shared language, trade customs, and the memory of being under the shadow of Ghana's markets. In the early 13th century, these people began to coalesce around a powerful leader named Sundiata Keita, a man whose story would blend history with legend. Born into a royal family in the small state of Kangaba, Sundiata was said to have been crippled as a child, mocked for his disability, and exiled when a rival claimed his family's throne. But exile, as it often does in epic tales, gave him time to build alliances. Sundiata's return would mark the beginning of Mali as an organized kingdom. The Battle of Kirina. In 1235 CE, Sundiata defeated the powerful Sasso king, Sumanguru Kante, at the Battle of Kirina. This battle is less remembered for its tactical details and more for its symbolic weight. Sumanguru, who had tried to fill the void left by Ghana's collapse, was said to be a sorcerer king, a man of arbitrary rule. Sundiata, in contrast, was portrayed as a just leader who consulted with elders and honored tradition. After Kirina, Sundiata declared himself Mansa, or emperor, and began consolidating the Mandinka states into a coherent empire. But unlike Ghana, Mali did not simply act as a toll gate. It began to expand eastward, southward, and across the middle of the Sahel. Sundiata's realm included not only gold fields and towns, but grazing lands, river ports, and trade hubs. He understood something new. Control the route, and you control the rhythm of trade. From Ghana's silence to Mali's structure, Sundiata did not erase Ghana's legacy, he absorbed it. He borrowed the idea of caravan taxation, the use of griot as state record keepers, and the strategy of allowing local rulers to remain in power under imperial oversight. But Mali went further. It became more centralized. It formalized governance through a charter known as the Kurokan Fauga, an oral constitution agreed upon by Sundiata and his nobles after Kirina. It addressed inheritance, marriage rights, clan responsibilities, and the rights of strangers, essential rules for an empire spread across many cultures and landscapes. The empire was organized into provinces, each overseen by a farin, a governor loyal to the emperor. Local customs were respected, but imperial taxes were collected and tribute was expected. It was a federation of sorts, but with strong central leadership that could command thousands of soldiers if needed. Mali was not built for conquest alone, it was built for continuity. Gold, salt, and the web of exchange. At its peak, the Mali Empire controlled the Bambuk, Bure, and eventually the Wangara goldfields among the richest on the continent. Unlike in Ghana, the empire took a more direct role in managing gold extraction and its distribution. Gold dust was common in everyday transactions, but gold nuggets were forbidden for private use. They were property of the state. This ensured the emperor maintained control over the empire's greatest asset. In return, salt flowed in from the north carried across the desert by camel caravans, each animal loaded with up to 300 pounds of salt. These caravans often stretched for miles and traveled for weeks, sometimes months, guided by stars, sand dunes, and oases remembered only by the oldest merchants. A typical caravan might leave from Sigil Massa or Tagheza, pass through Timbuktu, and arrive at Niamey, the imperial capital. The journey was perilous. Dust storms, bandits, and thirst could claim travelers without warning. And yet they came. The role of griots. In Mali, the griot was more than a storyteller. He was a living archive, a walking court historian, a diplomat, and sometimes even a royal advisor. Each noble family had its own griot, who memorized generations of marriages, battles, treaties, and land disputes. In a world where writing was rare and paper dissolved in humidity, griots were the filing cabinets of the empire. One of the most famous griots in West African history, Bala Faseke, served Sundiata himself. He was said to have accompanied the emperor from exile, through victory, and into the empire's formation. His descendants would go on to become a hereditary line of griots for the Keita dynasty. Even centuries after the empire's fall, griots in modern Mali and Guinea continue to recite the epic of Sundiata, passing it from voice to voice. Timbuktu and the Libraries of Sand. Though not founded by the Mali Empire, Timbuktu became one of its most famous cities. Located where the Niger River bends northward, Timbuktu emerged as a caravan terminus, a university town, and a hub of Islamic scholarship. Under later emperors, especially Mansa Musa, Timbuktu's mosques and libraries grew famous. Thousands of manuscripts on law, astronomy, medicine, and theology were copied, traded, and stored in clay buildings cooled by Sahelian breezes. The city was not just a stop on a trade route. It became a destination of the mind where caravans brought not only goods, but knowledge. Islamic scholars from Cairo, Fez, and even as far as Persia knew of Timbuktu. And though much of this fame would bloom after Sundiata's death, its foundations were laid during his reign. A kingdom of rhythm, not noise. Despite its size, the Mali Empire remained deeply grounded in tradition. The Mansa held court not in great palaces, but under open-air pavilions, shaded by woven mats, cooled by breezes drifting off the Niger. He was surrounded by nobles, griots, judges, and sometimes slaves, each playing their role in the quiet machinery of empire. Like Ghana before it, Mali did not celebrate itself in monuments or stone. Its greatness was procedural in how it managed movement, tribute, faith, and language across vast spaces. And just like Ghana, its stability was a matter of balance. But all balances face pressure. And with Mali, that pressure would arrive in two forms. Wealth so immense that it drew foreign attention, and power so centralized that succession became fragile. As the winds carried the scent of distant fires and the shuffling steps of camels approaching Timbuktu, a new figure was preparing to take Mali to heights that would astonish the Mediterranean world. His name was Mansa Musa. He would give away so much gold that the markets of Cairo and Mecca would tremble. But where did this wealth come from? And what was the cost of becoming a legend? The empire of Mali was already wealthy, already stable, and already influential by the time Mansa Musa took the throne. But it was under his leadership that the Mali Empire stepped beyond West Africa and entered the historical memory of the wider world not through conquest, not through battle, but through the steady weight of gold. His journey across the desert, known as his pilgrimage to Mecca, would become the stuff of global legend. But the deeper story of why he made the journey, how Mali was able to support it, and what ripples it left behind tells us more than the gold ever could. This was not just a tale of wealth. It was a story of diplomacy, theology, logistics, and the quiet reach of an empire built on rhythm. Who was Mansa Musa? Mansa Musa became ruler of Mali sometime around 1312 CE, though accounts of his early life are sparse. He was a member of the Keita dynasty, a lineage that traced its legitimacy back to Sundiata Keita, the founder of the empire. According to some Arabic chroniclers, Musa was appointed as deputy or regent when the previous emperor, possibly his brother, set off on an expedition across the Atlantic Ocean, never to return. Whether that story is apocryphal or not, it shows the kinds of tales Mali inspired, rooted in reality but stretching toward myth. Unlike many rulers before him, Mansa Musa did not remain content with managing internal affairs. He was devoutly Muslim, educated, and keenly aware of the value of public image. And so, in 1324, he departed Mali to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca required of all Muslims who are able. But his pilgrimage would not be a simple affair. It would become a diplomatic procession that stunned every city it passed through. A pilgrimage of immense proportions. Estimates vary, but contemporary accounts suggest that Mansa Musa's caravan included thousands of attendants, hundreds of camels, dozens of officials, soldiers, and scholars, and enormous quantities of gold, so much that the figures seem exaggerated, and yet consistently reported. The 14th century Syrian historian al-Umari, who later interviewed people who had met Musa, claimed the emperor brought 80 to 100 camels, each carrying between 300 to 500 pounds of gold dust. He also distributed gold freely along the way to merchants, to the poor, to rulers, and to religious institutions. In Cairo, the impact was immediate and disruptive. Musa gave away so much gold that it devalued the metal for over a decade, a real case of too much generosity, with economic consequences. Markets inflated. Prices fluctuated wildly. Gold lost its purchasing power, even in places where it had been stable for generations. The story of Mansa Musa spread far and wide. Gold as diplomacy. It is easy to imagine this event as merely extravagant, a display of imperial wealth meant to dazzle the Islamic world. But Musa's actions were strategic. By showing generosity in Cairo, Medina, and Mecca, he was embedding Mali in the larger Muslim Ummah, the community of believers. He was making alliances, opening routes for scholars, and establishing Mali as a legitimate Islamic empire, not just a regional power. He also acquired books, scholars, and architects during his travels. One of them, an Andalusian architect named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, would follow him back to Mali and help design mosques and palaces in cities like Timbuktu and Gao. Musa's pilgrimage was not a single act of faith, it was a long-term investment in Mali's image, infrastructure, and intellectual life. The return to Mali. When Mansa Musa returned, the empire was not the same. It was wealthier in connections, in knowledge, and in influence. He began investing in Islamic education, urban development, and the construction of mosques throughout Mali. The great mosque of Timbuktu, Djingueber Mosque, still standing today, was likely built during his reign. Timbuktu, already a trading town, became a center of scholarship. Its Sankore University eventually held tens of thousands of manuscripts, covering fields as diverse as astronomy, law, mathematics, and theology. The presence of books hand-copied, traded, and inherited became a status symbol. Families preserved them for generations. Owning a library in Mali meant more than wealth, it meant cultural credibility. Mansa Musa also expanded the empire's territory, bringing regions like Gao, Takeda, and even parts of the Tuareg north into Mali's orbit. These expansions were often more diplomatic than military, reflecting Musa's preference for tribute and alliance over outright domination. A world that finally noticed. Mansa Musa's journey did something few African events of the time could do. It appeared on European maps. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, a Spanish world map, famously includes a portrait of Mansa Musa seated on a golden throne, holding a nugget the size of a melon. He is labeled simply, the richest man in the world. In a time when much of Africa was rendered blank on European maps, Mali was suddenly real, a place of cities, wealth, and political structure. But this visibility came at a cost. As Mali became known, it also became a target not militarily, but economically. Arab and North African merchants now viewed the empire as a source of gold, slaves, and scholarly prestige. External pressures increased. Mali was no longer operating in relative anonymity. Musa's brilliance had put Mali on the map literally and figuratively, but it had also changed the nature of the empire's future challenges. The fragility of wealth. One of the unintended consequences of Musa's reign was over-centralization. His leadership was so effective, his charisma so strong, and his policies so transformative that later Mansas struggled to match his legacy. Wealth flowed freely under his rule. But wealth by its nature requires constant motion. Trade slowed when leadership weakened. When taxes were mismanaged or routes became unsafe, cities shrank. Desert winds reclaimed roadways. Caravans rerouted. By the mid-14th century, just decades after Musa's death, signs of strain began to show. Internal succession crises, regional rebellions, and the rise of rival trading centers all chipped away at Mali's dominance. The Songhai, formerly part of Mali's eastern holdings, would eventually break away and rise. But even in decline, Mali remained respected. Its scholars continued to teach. Its trade routes were still valued. Its memory endured. The Whispering Sands. When the winds blow across the Sahara, they erase footprints but not paths. Caravans continued long after Musa's death, less grand perhaps, but no less vital. And in towns like Djenné, Walata, and Timbuktu, traders told stories of the Mansa who carried more gold than sand, who prayed in Mecca, and who built libraries with the gifts of distant cities. His legacy was not just in the gold left behind, but in the architecture, the manuscripts, and the structures of faith and law that governed Mali for generations. His empire had codified trade, professionalized governance, and connected the African interior with the Islamic world. But questions remain. Could any empire maintain such a rhythm without faltering? And what happens when the next generation carries too much gold, but not enough wisdom? Empires rarely vanish in a single moment. More often, they fade slowly, like footprints in drifting sand. After the grandeur of Mansa Musa's reign, the Mali Empire entered a period of gradual decline marked not by a fall from grace, but by the unraveling of threads once tightly woven. The gold was still in the rivers, and the caravans still crossed the desert, but the center no longer held. And in time, new powers would rise, some inspired by Mali, others seeking to replace it. This is the story of Mali's long sunset, a tale of internal tensions, regional shifts, and the enduring whispers of a golden legacy. The succession problem. Mansa Musa had expanded Mali's borders, enriched its cities, and elevated its name across the known world. But he left behind a challenge that no caravan could carry: how to replace a ruler who had become legend. His son, Mansa Magha, succeeded him but failed to command the same authority. He lacked Musa's diplomatic finesse, his economic vision, and perhaps most importantly, the respect of the powerful provincial governors who held Mali together. A pattern began to emerge: short reigns, confused succession, and the emergence of regional warlords. Loyalty to the Mansa, once absolute, became conditional. In a system dependent on tribute and trust, this was fatal. For a time, the empire continued. It still collected taxes, it still minted gold. But its voice, once carried across the desert on camel hooves, grew quieter. The breaking of bonds. Mali had always been a network, a complex web of relationships, held together by trade, diplomacy, and prestige. Its territories stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Niger Bend, from the forest edge to the dunes of the Sahara. But these regions were diverse, each with their own languages, loyalties, and local rulers. Without a strong central hand, the web began to fray. First, the Tuareg tribes to the north reasserted control over Timbuktu. Then the Mossi kingdoms in the south pushed into Mali's territory, raiding towns and weakening trade. Most notably, in the mid-14th century, a city once under Mali's control began to assert its independence. Gao, on the bend of the Niger, home to the Songhai people. In Gao, a new power was gathering, one that would one day swallow what remained of Mali. The rise of the Songhai. By the late 14th century, Mali's eastern provinces had become vulnerable. The Songhai, led by ambitious leaders like Sunni Ali, began building a military-centered state that would eventually surpass Mali in both size and strength. While Mali's power had rested on trade, balance, and negotiation, Songhai's rise was driven by military conquest and state centralization. Timbuktu, once the jewel of Mansa Musa's legacy, was captured by the Songhai in 1468. Shortly after, Djenné followed. These cities, once proud centers of Mali's power, now flew new banners. And yet, Songhai borrowed much from its predecessor. Systems of taxation, caravan protection strategies, patronage of scholars and scribes, governance through regional appointees. Mali, like Ghana before it, had provided a blueprint. Mali's last gasps. By the 15th century, Mali had shrunk. It still controlled some gold fields, still governed certain river towns. But its northern and eastern provinces were lost. The empire's capital, no longer Niamey, but possibly Kangaba, once more was reduced to a provincial town. Occasionally, a new Mansa would rise and attempt to restore order. There were brief flashes of military resurgence, but each attempt was met with the same limitations. Fewer trade routes under control, diminished tax base, independent vassals unwilling to rejoin, rival empires with superior organization. Even the Portuguese, arriving on the West African coast in the mid-15th century, noted that Mali was still known, but it was no longer feared. The empire lingered like a shadow at dusk, recognizable, but no longer central. The intellectual legacy. What endured, perhaps more than anything, was the intellectual infrastructure Mali had cultivated. Timbuktu remained a center of learning long after it left Mali's grasp. Its libraries, filled with Arabic manuscripts on law, philosophy, science, and poetry, were protected by local scholars and families who viewed them as sacred. These manuscripts, many of them copied during or shortly after Mansa Musa's reign, survive to this day. Stored in wooden boxes, passed through generations, they are among the most extensive pre-colonial written records in sub-Saharan Africa. The Sankor, Sidi Yahya, and Djingueber mosques stood not just as places of worship, but as universities. Students came from across the region to study, memorize, and debate. Though Mali's political structure crumbled, its intellectual pulse endured. The stories carried on. In towns across modern Mali, Guinea, Senegal, and the Gambia, the name of Mansa Musa still echoes in song and story. Griots, inheritors of centuries of memory, continue to recite the epic of Sundiata and the golden age of Musa's pilgrimage. These are not merely tales, they are historical archives, encoded in rhythm and tone, updated subtly with each generation. Through these oral traditions, Mali remains alive not as a state, but as an idea, a point of cultural pride, a reminder that there was once a time when Africa shaped the world's economy, not just responded to it. In markets and family gatherings, the name Mali is still invoked as a symbol of greatness. And in the collective consciousness of West Africa, it is not a fallen empire, but a foundation. Echoes in the modern world. Mali's legacy lingers in place names, in languages, in systems of land ownership and family structure. It also lingers in the nation-state that bears its name today, though its borders do not match the old empire. In the early 1960s, when the French colony of French Sudan gained independence, its leaders chose the name Mali for the new republic, just as Ghana had done in 1957. This naming was more than symbolic. It was a deliberate act of historical reclamation. By invoking the Mali Empire, post-colonial leaders were asserting a pre-colonial African identity, one that demonstrated economic complexity, cultural richness, and political sovereignty long before European maps were drawn. And while the modern Republic of Mali faces challenges vastly different from its imperial namesake, the memory of what once was continues to anchor hope. What the winds remember. If you stood today in the Sahara and listened to the wind, you wouldn't hear voices. But you might hear the rhythm of footsteps long buried, the steady march of camels carrying slabs of salt, the murmur of griots at royal courts, the chant of students in the shade of mud-brick mosques. Mali may be gone as an empire, but its rhythms of movement, exchange, learning, and faith continue to inform the shape of West Africa. And it leaves behind a final, quiet question. Can the wealth of a civilization ever outlive its wisdom? And when the caravans are gone, what remains, gold or memory? Story 3. The City of Timbuktu, a library in the desert. You've likely heard the name Timbuktu, perhaps as a metaphor for a faraway place, or as a city veiled in dust and legend. But Timbuktu was never just a name on an old map or a metaphor for isolation. At its height, it was a living archive, a place where books were traded like jewels, where students studied by lamplight in sand-walled courtyards, and where the pulse of intellectual life beat steadily beneath the surface of the Sahara. Before it was a city of scholars, it was a campsite. Before it was a center of Islamic learning, it was a well by the river. And before it was known to the world, it had already become indispensable to the desert. From tent to town, the Tuareg beginnings. Timbuktu began not with royal decree, but with a well. In the 11th century, Tuareg nomads, the blue-robed pastoralists of the Central Sahara, established a seasonal camp near a bend of the Niger River, not far from where the river turned north toward the desert. They chose the spot for its strategic location, a place where caravans from the north met river trade from the south. Legend says the camp was guarded by an old woman named Buktu, who cared for it in the nomads' absence. The name Timbuktu is sometimes said to mean the Well of Buktu, though linguists continue to debate its origins. Whatever its true etymology, Timbuktu grew slowly, nourished not by conquest but by convenience. By the 12th century, it was no longer just a stopover, it had become a settlement of traders, scribes, and seekers. The desert may seem barren, but it hosts one of the oldest and most consistent economic systems in the world, the trans-Saharan caravan trade. And Timbuktu, by accident of geography and persistence of effort, became one of its most essential junctions. the city and the sand, foundations of trade. Timbuktu's earliest growth came from its place at a crossroads. From the north, caravans brought salt, cloth, paper, and horses from Morocco, Algeria, and further afield. From the south, traders floated gold, cola nuts, ivory, and enslaved people up the Niger River. From the east came books and Islamic scholars. From the west, local agricultural produce. But there was no empire-building walls around the city in these early days. No royal charter granted its existence. Its survival depended entirely on its utility. It was a neutral market, open to Tuareg, Mande, Soninke, Fulani, and later, Arabs and Berbers alike. Timbuktu's residents were multilingual, accustomed to negotiation, and surprisingly cosmopolitan, even in a town of mud-brick houses. And its merchants learned early that books, not gold or salt, would become the city's most prized possession. Islam and the culture of literacy. By the 13th century, Timbuktu had become a deeply Islamic town, though its version of Islam reflected the local landscape. Imams prayed in open-roofed mosques. Muezzins climbed wooden scaffolds rather than minarets. Clerics wore turbans and carried walking sticks instead of staffs of office. Here, faith blended with function. Literacy, especially in Arabic, became both a religious duty and an economic advantage. A man who could read the Quran could also calculate weights, compose contracts, and translate foreign letters. In a city where the value of goods fluctuated with the movement of the dunes, such skills were priceless. And so Islamic schools, or madrasas, began to multiply. At first they were small affairs: a teacher, a reed mat, a handful of boys scratching Arabic letters into wooden slates. But as the city grew, families competed to sponsor teachers, and students began to arrive from neighboring cities, then from farther afield. By the time the Mali Empire incorporated Timbuktu in the 14th century, the city was already famous for its piety, its order, and its quiet devotion to study. The mosques that anchored the mind. Timbuktu's physical center was defined by 3 iconic mosques, each tied to the city's intellectual life. The Djinguereber Mosque, built during the reign of Mansa Musa, likely with the help of the Andalusian architect al-Sahili. This was the spiritual and scholarly center of the city. Its sandy walls, timber beams, and open courtyards became a model for West African mosque architecture. The Sankore Mosque, not just a place of prayer, but the home of Sankore University, the heart of Timbuktu's educational system. Sankore would come to house tens of thousands of handwritten manuscripts, covering not only religious topics but also law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The Sidi Yahya Mosque, completed in the 15th century, it symbolized the spiritual continuity of the city and hosted generations of imams and scholars who maintained Timbuktu's prestige. These mosques were not separated from the markets or the homes; they were woven into the daily rhythm of the city. And each hosted schools, libraries, and debates, manuscripts and memory. By the 15th century, Timbuktu was no longer simply receiving books, it was producing them. Families of scribes and scholars created copying houses, where manuscripts were laboriously transcribed with reed pens and homemade ink. These weren't mass-market texts. They were custom copies, sometimes with marginal notes, family genealogies, or legal addenda. They were passed down from father to son, donated to mosques, or traded among scholars like relics. Some were bound in goatskin, others stored in leather cases or wrapped in cloth. Their topics ranged from Islamic law, fiqh, Quranic exegesis, Sufi poetry, medical treatises, mathematics and geometry, astronomical charts. Manuscripts became status symbols. To own a library in Timbuktu was to possess more than wealth. It meant honor, knowledge, and ancestral prestige. Families curated their libraries for generations. Some even refused to sell books to outsiders not for profit, but for fear of losing a piece of the family's soul. Trade meets text. Despite its scholarly fame, Timbuktu was still a working city, a place of commerce, not cloisters. Every week, camel caravans would roll into town, and merchants from the desert fringes would haggle in markets shaded by woven mats. Gold, though still traded, was not the only measure of value. Salt slabs, heavy, gray, and covered in white dust, lined market stalls. Textiles, spices, and beads flowed from every direction. And somewhere in the bustle, a scholar might trade a treatise on jurisprudence for a bundle of Moroccan paper, or a book of astronomy for a rare inkstone from Cairo. This was not a world of abstract academia. It was a city where ideas had market value, and where the scholar and merchant were often the same man. The whispered reputation. By the time the Songhai Empire absorbed Timbuktu in the late 15th century, the city was already renowned across the Islamic world. Arab geographers and historians like Leo Africanus described it as a place where many handwritten books are sold, and more profit is made by selling manuscripts than any other merchandise. The city's reputation was whispered across the dunes, passed between caravan leaders and wandering mystics. But in its quiet, it also drew envy. And eventually, it would draw more dangerous eyes. But for now, Timbuktu stood steady, not behind walls, but behind reputation, ritual, and rhythm. It was a place where students walked barefoot to class, where families copied texts by lantern light, and where the written word meant survival. But how long could a city built on books survive in a world ruled increasingly by swords? As new powers rose and foreign empires turned toward Africa's interior, Timbuktu's silence would be broken. Who came to conquer the city of scholars? And what became of the libraries when war reached the gates? In the cool of early morning, before the market awoke and before the minarets echoed the call to prayer, you could walk through the alleys of Timbuktu and hear nothing but the rustling of parchment. A boy hunched over a wooden tablet, tracing Arabic letters. An old scholar reading by oil lamp, his lips silently moving in rhythm with the text. In this city, built not from stone but from memory, books were breath. But even the calmest archive cannot remain untouched forever. As empires shifted and ambitions sharpened, foreign powers turned their gaze toward Timbuktu, some seeking wealth, others knowledge, and some simply control. This is the story of the 15th and 16th centuries, when Timbuktu's silence was broken, and the city's identity as a sanctuary of scholarship was put to the test. The Songhai Ascendancy. By the mid-1400s, the Mali Empire had begun to fray at its edges. Trade routes drifted eastward. Vassal cities declared independence. And in Gao, a new power was rising. The Songhai Empire, under the leadership of Sani Ali, began to consolidate military and commercial control over the Niger River region. In 1468, Sani Ali arrived at the gates of Timbuktu. But unlike the gentle integration of the Mali Empire a century earlier, Songhai's entry was an invasion. Ali was a skilled general, known for swift cavalry and tactical river maneuvers. But he had little patience for clerics or scholars. In his mind, Timbuktu was a strategic prize, a key to trade, not a sanctuary for scribes. When he captured the city, some reports suggest he looted homes, exiled resistant clerics, and disrupted the schools that had made Timbuktu famous. But he also left the city structurally intact. He needed its commerce, if not its customs. A shift in patronage. After Sani Ali's death, his successor, Askia Mohammed I, brought a different temperament to rule. Where Ali saw strategy, Askia Mohammed saw sanctity. A devout Muslim and reformer, he sought to rebuild Timbuktu's reputation as an Islamic hub. He restored damaged institutions, brought scholars back, and ensured that religious courts and madrasas resumed their work. Under Askia's guidance, Timbuktu entered a second golden age not of explosive growth, but of refinement and repair. He invited scholars from Morocco and Egypt. He supported judges, qadis, who applied Islamic law in civil matters. He maintained caravan security, ensuring that trade continued to pass safely through the city. It was under the Songhai dynasty that the libraries swelled, the manuscript culture expanded, and students from across the Sahel once again gathered in Sankor's shade. Askia Muhammad ruled not just with armies but with ink. The lifeblood of the city, its scholars. By the 16th century, Timbuktu boasted an array of scholars whose works survive today in dusty trunks and preserved bundles. Among them, Ahmed Baba, perhaps the most famous. He was a prolific writer and jurist who authored more than 40 books, including legal opinions, biographies, and theological treatises. His library was said to have contained over 1,600 volumes. Mahmud Kadi, a historian and chronicler who helped compile the Tariq al-Fatish, a record of Songhai's rise and fall. Abd al-Rahman al-Sadi, the author of the Tariq al-Sudan, one of the most important sources on West African political and scholarly history. These scholars didn't just preserve knowledge, they interpreted, debated, and expanded it. Manuscripts were not sacred relics. They were working documents, full of marginalia, commentaries, corrections, and cross-references. Students would copy entire texts by hand, then write their thoughts in the margins. This was not passive learning. It was dialogue across generations. In this way, Timbuktu became not just a library, but a living intellectual organism. Morocco's eyes turned south. By the late 16th century, Timbuktu's fame had grown too large to ignore. To the north, the Saadian dynasty of Morocco, ruled by Ahmed al-Mansur, faced declining revenues and increasing political pressure. They looked south to Songhai's gold fields and to Timbuktu's legendary wealth. In 1591, the Moroccans launched a military expedition across the Sahara, led by Judar Pasha, a Spanish-born convert to Islam. They brought firearms, a weapon unknown to the Songhai armies. The decisive Battle of Tondabai ended in Moroccan victory, and Songhai's centralized power shattered almost overnight. Timbuktu fell without much resistance. But the price of conquest was not only political. The sack of the city, the Moroccan occupation of Timbuktu, disrupted the fragile ecosystem that had supported centuries of learning. Scholars were imprisoned, exiled, or heavily taxed. Ahmed Baba himself was arrested and sent in chains to Morocco, along with parts of his vast library. In exile, he continued to write and teach, but his forced removal symbolized a wider crisis. Manuscripts were looted or lost. Patronage dried up. Trade routes, now destabilized by war, faltered. Though Morocco claimed Timbuktu, they could not govern it effectively. The logistical nightmare of sustaining power across the Sahara proved too much. Over time, their grip weakened, but the damage was already done. Timbuktu was never the same. The slow fade. In the centuries that followed, Timbuktu continued as a town of local significance, but its days as an international beacon of learning faded into memory. Colonial powers, first the French, later others, treated Timbuktu as a curiosity, not a center of brilliance. Some manuscripts were destroyed through neglect. Others were stolen or sold to European collectors. Yet many survived, hidden by families in basements, attics, and mud wall alcoves, passed down quietly through generations. They were preserved not by states or armies, but by memory, devotion, and inheritance. Even today, scholars continue to catalog, digitize, and translate these texts, rescuing them from oblivion. What the books remember. In the manuscripts of Timbuktu, we find everything: prayers and poetry, medical diagrams and maps of stars, legal arguments and agricultural calendars, personal notes. This book belongs to my uncle's son. May Allah protect his learning. These books whisper the everyday thoughts of a scholarly city not obsessed with conquest, but with understanding the world. And in the margins, you can still see ink faded from sun and sweat, evidence of a student's hand steadying in the dry heat, writing not for kings, but for time. But what happens when the world forgets that such a place existed? When it becomes only a metaphor, not a memory? Is the survival of knowledge in silence a victory or a warning? Timbuktu never truly disappeared. Even when the gold dried up, when the Moroccan garrisons pulled back, and when the caravans thinned out, the city endured not as an empire's outpost, but as a place of preservation. Its streets, once filled with debate and the rustling of scrolls, grew quiet. But in the quiet, the city remembered. This final chapter is not a story of conquest or construction. It is the story of survival, how the libraries of Timbuktu, like the desert itself, endured erosion, invasion, and time through the hands of families, the whispers of griots, and the stubbornness of paper wrapped in cloth. Hidden in plain view. After the Moroccan conquest of 1591, Timbuktu lost its status as a political capital. But its people remained. Families that had once copied manuscripts for scholars now copied them for their children. Scholars who once lectured in crowded courtyards now taught in private homes, away from colonial eyes. The city's intellectual wealth was dispersed, but not destroyed. Manuscripts were no longer kept in public institutions. They were hidden in trunks, wrapped in animal skins, buried in earthen jars, and passed down with family lineages. Some were read only once every few years, others not at all. Over time, Timbuktu became a city rich in forgotten knowledge. And as colonialism swept across West Africa in the 19th and early 20th centuries, European explorers and administrators often missed the manuscripts entirely, dismissing the city as a dusty relic of a long-lost empire. What they failed to see was the intellectual underground, quiet, self-sufficient, and resilient. The colonial glaze. When French forces took control of the region in the late 1800s, they found a sleepy town with crumbling mosques and long-forgotten trade routes. To colonial eyes, Timbuktu was disappointing. It did not yield gold mines or rich plantations. It did not boast monumental architecture. It seemed to be at best a poetic myth. But some scholars took notice. They found fragments of Arabic manuscripts in private homes. They noticed that local elites spoke Arabic, used Islamic legal systems, and retained genealogies going back centuries. Yet colonial priorities did not center on preservation, and certainly not on the empowerment of indigenous intellectual history. And so, the manuscripts remained where they had always been, in family hands, quietly guarded by those who still believed in the power of written memory. The reawakening of the manuscripts. By the late 20th century, West African historians, Islamic scholars, and cultural preservationists began to take renewed interest in Timbuktu's manuscript tradition. With independence movements sweeping across Africa, there was a growing hunger to reclaim African historical agency. In Mali, local efforts began to catalog, preserve, and digitize thousands of manuscripts. By the 1990s, libraries such as the Ahmed Baba Institute of Higher Learning and Islamic Research were established, named after the city's most famous scholar. Projects began to surface. Family libraries were invited to loan or donate their manuscripts. Scholars from around the world traveled to study the texts. Local youth were trained in manuscript handling, conservation, and scanning. It was a slow, deliberate process, one that required trust. These were not just old books. They were heirlooms, sacred objects, and documents of identity. What the manuscripts contain. Estimates vary, but historians believe over 300,000 manuscripts survive in Timbuktu and its surrounding villages. The manuscripts vary in condition, subject, and style. Some are richly decorated with colored inks and gold leaf. Others are barely legible, written in faded script on scraps of camel skin. Their content includes religious texts, Quranic interpretation, hadith commentaries, prayer guides. Legal rulings covering property rights, marriage, slavery, inheritance. Medical treatises, herbal remedies, anatomy diagrams, treatments for fever and infection. Astronomy, lunar calendar, star charts, celestial predictions. Philosophy and ethics, discussions of morality, politics, and human behavior. History and biography, records of local rulers, saints, and scholars. Personal notes, marginalia, poetry, riddles, and even recipes. The manuscripts are written in classical Arabic, local dialects, and Ajami, a script that uses Arabic letters to write African languages like Songhai and Fulfulde. They reveal a civilization that was cosmopolitan, curious, and connected. A city under threat once more. In 2012, Timbuktu once again made international headlines not for its manuscripts, but for the threat of their destruction. Armed groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, seized control of northern Mali, including Timbuktu. They declared Sharia law, banned music, desecrated Sufi shrines, and threatened the libraries. Fearing another cultural catastrophe, local scholars and librarians took action. Under cover of night, they smuggled thousands of manuscripts out of the city, hiding them in metal trunks, wicker baskets, and satchels, transporting them by canoe, motorbike, and car to Bamako, Mali's southern capital. This operation was not state-led. It was a grassroots effort organized by families, teachers, and quiet heroes. Their bravery saved an estimated 95% of the city's manuscripts. Reflections on memory. Timbuktu's story is not one of grand conquests or enduring monuments. It is a story of ideas, preserved not by armies but by individual acts of care. It is the rare city that owes its survival not to stone walls or steel weapons, but to ink on paper, names whispered across centuries, and the belief that knowledge belongs to everyone, not just rulers. Today, the rescued manuscripts are still being digitized, translated, and studied. They are helping scholars challenge long-standing assumptions about pre-colonial Africa, proving that there was not just oral history, but written tradition, scientific inquiry, and legal thought. In a world that often associates Africa's past with silence, Timbuktu speaks in ink. The desert remembers. As the Harmattan winds blow fine dust through the city's alleys, the sand still covers the footprints of centuries. But it does not erase everything. In hidden rooms, in locked boxes, in the careful fingers of a boy tracing Arabic letters by candlelight, Timbuktu lives on. It is not a lost city. It is a remembered city, one whose quiet has been mistaken for absence. And so, the final legacy of Timbuktu is this: a city where the pen, not the sword, shaped civilization. Story 4. The Sahelian merchants of Songhai counting coins of dust and salt. There are empires that rise with a roar, and others that emerge like a tide, quietly filling the spaces left behind by others. The Songhai Empire was one such tide. It did not blaze into existence with a single victory or a prophet's revelation. Instead, it rose patiently, built by merchants, guided by the river, and governed by the memory of Mali's fatting grandeur. In the soft bend of the Niger River, where the waters curve like a drawn bow through the Sahel, the city of Gao sat quietly for centuries. Gao did not shout. It counted measured goods, tallied taxes, recorded names. By the time the Mali Empire weakened in the 14th century, Songhai was already preparing not to replace Mali in form, but to reshape West Africa in its own image: structured, mobile, river-bound, and deeply mercantile. A city before the empire. Gao's history stretches back at least to the 9th century, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in West Africa. Strategically located along the middle Niger River, it sat at the intersection of Sahelian agriculture, Saharan trade, and riverine transport. Gao was never as flamboyant as Timbuktu nor as central as Niamey, but it was efficient. From the start, it functioned as a node, not just a place to live, but a place to store, sort, and send. Salt from the north, gold from the south, livestock from the plains, cola nuts from the forest all passed through Gao's warehouses and open-air markets. The rulers of this early city were known as the Za dynasty, a local elite who likely mixed animist practice with early Islamic influences from North African traders. By the 11th century, the Za rulers had converted to Islam, and Gao began to attract Arabic-speaking scholars, scribes, and judges. But still, Gao was not yet an empire. It was a well-run town with regional importance, a merchant's hub, a scholar's retreat, a caravan rest point. Its future would change with the slow retreat of Mali. Mali's shadow and Songhai's patience. As Mali's central authority began to wane in the 14th century, its hold on outer provinces like Gao weakened. The Songhai people, who had long lived under Mali's sphere of influence, sensed opportunity. But they didn't rebel all at once. They waited. And as Mali's manses grew more distant and internal disputes plagued its succession, Gao quietly asserted itself. Around 1375, Songhai declared its independence from Mali. There was no revolution, no loud rupture. Just the closing of Mali's tax offices in Gao and the reopening of Songhai's own. This marked the beginning of a transformation that would take nearly a century. And it began with merchants, not monarchs. The power of paper, not sword. While Mali had thrived through central control, Songhai advanced through commercial reach. Its early rulers understood that wealth comes not from what you possess, but from what you can move. And the Niger River moved everything. Merchants used canoes and flat-bottomed boats to transport rice, fish, leather, and salt between towns. On land, camel caravans continued to bring copper, textiles, and paper from the north. In the south, Songhai couriers traveled forest paths to barter for gold and enslaved labor. Songhai did not need to mine gold or cut salt itself. It needed to count the transactions, standardize the weights, and record the taxes. To do this, it needed scribes. Arabic literacy became the backbone of bureaucracy. Each transaction was recorded with painstaking precision: quantities, origins, taxes owed, and signatures or seals. For many Songhai merchants, a ledger book was more powerful than a spear. The first expansion, Sunni Ali. But commerce alone cannot build empires. Eventually, someone must defend the caravan routes, regulate disputes, and ensure loyalty. In the 15th century, that someone was Sunni Ali. Ruling from 1464 to 1492, Sunni Ali was not a merchant. He was a soldier, a strategist, and, according to some sources, a man of ambiguous religion, one who performed Muslim rites but retained local animist practices. What made Sunni Ali different was that he married mobility with aggression. He turned Songhai from a trading network into a military machine, one capable of seizing cities, building garrisons, and punishing disloyalty. His greatest conquest came in 1468, when he captured Timbuktu, then controlled by Tuareg factions after Mali's decline. Ali's forces did not treat Timbuktu gently. Scholars were exiled. Libraries were looted. For the first time, the city of scholars experienced the full weight of imperial absorption. Sunni Ali also took Jenne, another crucial city at the junction of trade and scholarship. By the time of his death, Songhai had become the largest empire in West Africa, stretching from the edge of the Sahara to the forests of the south. But the merchant core remained. Even as the swords expanded Songhai's reach, the scales and ledgers sustained it. Cities in harmony with water. What made Songhai unique among West African empires was its river-based identity. Unlike the desert-bound capitals of Ghana or the market-based cores of Mali, Songhai's administrative and military apparatus was deeply rooted in the Niger's rhythm. Towns were spaced based on boat travel. Communication between provinces followed the current. Military campaigns were timed around floods and dry seasons. The empire developed a naval corps of soldiers trained to fight on boats. Commanders oversaw fleets that could patrol trade routes and suppress piracy along the riverbanks. Fish, rice, and river reeds were not just food, they were infrastructure. They fed soldiers, paid laborers, and built the boats that held the empire together. Songhai's soul was aquatic. Its currency was not only coins, but measured sacks of grain, barrels of salted fish, and bundles of river reeds. It was a fluid empire in every sense. The challenge of belief. Even as Songhai expanded, religious identity remained complex. Sunni Ali, despite ruling a mostly Muslim elite, was suspected by some of being insufficiently Islamic. He supported local spirit cults, patronized animist priests, and reportedly destroyed certain Islamic institutions during his conquests. To the scholars of Timbuktu, this was troubling. They had grown used to the patronage of Mali's Islamic Mansa's rulers who built mosques, consulted clerics, and followed the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence. Ali's blend of religion and power created tension between state and scholar, between soldier and scribe. But the empire remained stable because it remained functional. Trade continued, taxes were paid, and merchants, whatever their religion, supported any ruler who could protect the roads and regulate the markets. From dust to coin. In Songhai, salt was still traded like gold, but coinage became more common. Copper coins, often struck in the style of North African dinars, circulated in markets alongside gold dust and barter goods. But even more valuable were standardized weights, small iron or stone cubes used to measure gold dust with precision. A good merchant didn't just carry goods, he carried his own set of scales, polished and tested daily. Songhai's markets were scenes of quiet competition, not loud bargaining. In Gao, you could watch a merchant weigh salt with one hand while calculating grain prices in his head. In Jenne, scribes recorded sale contracts on small slips of parchment. Here, the act of trade was a performance, one that combined memory, math, and meticulous record-keeping. But what happens when an empire becomes too reliant on paper, too large to count? What happens when the coins stop matching the ledgers, and the river's current no longer carries wealth, but warning? After the storm of Sunni Ali's conquests, the empire of Songhai stood vast and uncertain. It had cities, trade routes, and soldiers, but it lacked something deeper: cohesion. Many of the urban scholars and Muslim elites distrusted Sunni Ali's mixture of military ambition and religious ambiguity. His death in 1492 created a vacuum not only of power, but of ideological clarity. Into this breach stepped a man who would transform Songhai from a riverine trading empire into a unified Islamic state with global significance. His name was Askia Muhammad, and he would become not only an emperor, but a reformer, pilgrim, and economic strategist. Under Askia's leadership, Songhai reached its intellectual and administrative zenith. And once again, paper, coin, and salt became the instruments of imperial purpose. A coup in the capital. Askia Mohammed, born Mohammed Tur, was not of the royal Sunni lineage. He had served under Sunni Ali as a general, but he was also a devout Muslim, and he used that faith to claim legitimacy. When Sunni Ali's son, Sunni Baru, took the throne and refused to enforce Islamic law, Mohammed led a coalition of scholars, merchants, and military leaders to challenge him. In 1493, he defeated Baru at the Battle of Anfao, seized Gao, and declared himself Askia, a title possibly derived from usurper. Despite its origins, the title became synonymous with order, reform, and imperial purpose. Askia Mohammed understood that conquest must be followed by codification. He set about building an empire not just of land, but of law, trade, and learning. The Islamic bureaucracy. Askia Mohammed's reign brought Songhai something it had never fully developed: a centralized Islamic bureaucracy. He appointed governors, farans, to oversee provinces and report directly to the imperial court. Standardized taxation, creating categories for trade goods, land use, and religious offerings. Commissioned legal scholars to oversee courts and arbitrate disputes using Maliki Islamic law. Created a body of scribes and administrators mostly drawn from Timbuktu and Janneh, who maintained imperial records in Arabic. This was no longer just an empire of merchants. It had become an empire of administrators, where rulers were judged by their ability to organize paper, not just command soldiers. Merchants applauded these changes. Predictability in taxation, secure caravan routes, and access to trained judges increased commercial confidence. Markets grew. Imports diversified. And the rhythm of empire measured in coin weight and parchment length quickened. Askia's pilgrimage. In 1496, 3 years after taking power, Askia Mohammed undertook the Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca. He did so not as a curiosity, like Mansa Musa before him, but as a strategic gesture, a demonstration of religious legitimacy and an effort to embed Songhai within the broader Islamic world. Askia traveled with a large entourage of soldiers, scholars, and scribes. He met with the Caliph in Cairo, conferred with jurists in Mecca, and returned with Arabic books, Egyptian scholars, and diplomatic recognition as the Islamic ruler of West Africa. His pilgrimage was not simply a religious act, it was a declaration. Songhai was not a fringe state. It was a core participant in global Islam, tied by faith and finance to cities like Fez, Cairo, and Mecca. Back in Gao, Askia constructed Islamic courts, funded new mosques, and deepened ties between provincial markets and the imperial center. Timbuktu under Songhai. During Askia's reign, Timbuktu flourished once again. The scholar Ahmed Baba, who had once lived in hiding during Sunni Ali's rule, now lectured freely. Scribes copied legal texts, theological commentaries, and even poetry. Judges issued fatwas, legal rulings based on Maliki law. Libraries expanded not only in mosques, but in private homes, guild halls, and family compounds. Merchants from North Africa returned, bringing books, spices, glassware, and silver. Students arrived from as far away as present-day Chad and Senegal to study under Timbuktu's clerics. Under Songhai, Timbuktu was no longer an awkward conquest. It was a partner in governance. And as the city's influence grew, so did the paperwork, contracts, rulings, tax records, ledgers, all written in a blend of classical Arabic and local Ajami scripts. This bureaucracy, while invisible to soldiers, was the true machinery of empire. Currency and counting. Askia Mohammed also advanced monetary policy. While barter and gold dust still prevailed in smaller markets, he introduced more widespread copper coinage. minted in imperial workshops. He regulated trade weights, imposed tariffs on foreign traders, and created state-monitored caravanserais rest stops where merchants could sleep, resupply, and pay customs duties. Salt, still a major import from Tagheza and Talyudeni, was counted like currency. A slab of salt could buy a tunic. 2 could buy a goat. 10 might pay the annual tax on a merchant shop. Salt was also used to pay soldiers proof of its enduring value. Askia's rule turned Songhai into a place where tax receipts mattered more than tribal loyalty, and where a literate scribe with an inkwell had more daily power than a spear-carrying guard. Challenges beneath the surface. Yet even as Songhai thrived, fragilities accumulated. Askia Muhammad, in his later years, became blind. His sons vied for power. Military commanders questioned the cost of maintaining such a vast, paperwork-heavy empire. Outlying provinces, especially those far from the Niger, grumbled about taxation, without adequate military support. Though Askia's vision for order had brought unprecedented stability, it also created bureaucratic dependence. If the scribes were corrupt, the system faltered. If the governors rebelled, the center struggled to respond. And deep in the Saharan north, another problem was growing. Morocco's ambitions. The Moroccans, rich in ambition but short on gold, knew of Songhai's resources and its vulnerability to long-distance assault. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would not be decided by cavalry, but by gunpowder, a weapon Songhai had not yet mastered. The edge of collapse. Askia Muhammad's death in 1538 was the beginning of Songhai's long descent. His successor's sons and nephew struggled to maintain the empire's scale and coherence. Internal rebellions, military overreach, and diminishing control over gold routes began to strain the state. But the biggest threat was external. In 1591, Moroccan forces armed with arquebuses and cannons crossed the Sahara under the leadership of Judar Pasha. Songhai's armies, despite their numbers, could not withstand the firepower. The Battle of Tondabai ended in a crushing defeat. Gao was taken, Timbuktu was looted. The Askia line fled, the bureaucrats were scattered. But the merchants, they did what they always had. They adapted. Markets reopened, trade continued in fragmented form. Salt still moved, gold still glittered. But the empire was gone. So what does it mean when an empire built on counting loses its ability to count? Can scribes survive where soldiers fall? And when the coin becomes dust again, what remains of the merchant's dream? In the long, slow dusk of empire, not every decline is sharp. Some empires fall like struck stone, shattering in battle and fire. But others, like Songhai, dissolve, their borders blurring, their records fading, their people continuing on as if the empire were only one chapter in a much longer book. The Battle of Tondabai in 1591 was the military breaking point. But the economic systems, commercial routes, and cultural practices built over centuries did not vanish with the Askias. Instead, they adapted, split, and carried on. This is the final chapter in the story of Songhai, not a tale of ruin, but of resilience. Not the end of trade, but its reweaving across new lines. The empire was gone, but the merchants still had ledgers to keep, caravans to guide, and salt to weigh. Ghosts in the capital. After the Moroccan victory, the imperial heartland cities like Gao and Timbuktu entered a strange phase of military occupation without full control. Moroccan troops, led by Judar Pasha and later governors, occupied key cities but never managed to control the full extent of Songhai's territory. They faced logistical nightmares, as the Sahara was a thin and brittle supply line. Resistance from rural populations, loyal to former Songhai rulers. And perhaps most challenging, an economy that relied more on trust, social networks, and local languages than on centralized commands. The Moroccan forces could conquer cities, but they could not command loyalty from merchants, boatmen, and scribes who kept the real engine of Songhai humming. So while the imperial court was broken, the economic system partially survived. The river remembers. Trade along the Niger River slowed, but it never stopped. Boats continued their steady routes from Gao to Janneh, passing through. Rice paddies still tended by families with ancestral land claims. Markets still quoting prices in gold dust. And small towns still governed by descendants of Songhai administrators, now styling themselves as local chiefs or river kings. The infrastructure of Songhai, built over generations, outlasted the empire that created it. Just as Roman roads once guided medieval traders across Europe, Songhai's river ports, caravan routes, and toll systems shaped commerce in West Africa for centuries to follow. In a real sense, the Songhai Empire became something more than a memory. It became a template, the survival of the scribes. While Moroccan forces looted books and libraries in Timbuktu, not all was lost. Many families, especially the scholar-clerical elite, hid manuscripts in underground storage, walled-in compartments, or passed them on in secret. These texts, legal judgments, commercial contracts, astronomical treatises, medical formulas, and detailed family histories continued to circulate in informal schools known as madrasas, or within family-based zawiyas, religious lodges. Through them, Songhai's bureaucratic spirit survived. Even into the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars in Timbuktu still taught from textbooks copied in the 15th century, referencing Askia Muhammad's court or earlier Timbuktu judges. Paper, it turns out, outlives the sword as long as someone is willing to hide it, read it, and pass it on. A network, not a state. In the post-imperial era, the geography of Songhai's legacy transformed. Instead of a centralized empire, West Africa became a patchwork of commercial alliances and cultural zones, often linked by shared languages like Songhai and Arabic, religious affiliation, particularly Sufi Islam, and long-standing mercantile traditions rooted in the Sahel. Cities like Kano, Agadez, and Bamako rose in prominence. New trade centers emerged. But the memory of Songhai remained, not as a government, but as a kind of spatial logic, a set of mental maps shared by merchants and scholars alike. You knew where to find salt. You knew the signs of good gold. You knew which river bends hid the safe anchorage. And you knew that at every point along the trade route, there would be someone with a ledger and a memory of older, deeper rules. Language, law, and salt. Even today, the Songhai language is spoken across parts of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, a living testament to the cultural cohesion created by the empire's trade routes. Legal traditions in the region still reflect Maliki interpretations favored during Askia Muhammad's rule. And salt. Salt remains a currency in memory. In desert towns like Taoudeni, slabs are still cut from dry, shimmering pits and strapped to camels just as they were centuries ago. Salt is no longer traded like gold, but in oral histories, it still holds value as a metaphor for necessity, for trade, and for the effort that connects one life to another across the desert. The old traders used to say, "A caravan without salt is like a sentence without a verb." In that way, even the dullest item, salt, became the structural grammar of an entire region. Reflections, the Paperweight Empire. The Songhai Empire's greatness was never just in its size, though it was the largest in West African history. It lay in its ability to translate motion into order, to turn goods into ledgers, to make languages travel with letters. to make faith move along river paths, to make bureaucrats into peacemakers. This was not a romantic empire of epic battles or towering architecture. It was a boring empire in the most beautiful way. One that knew that order matters, that commerce is culture, and that salt, when measured carefully, can hold together entire civilizations. Even now, centuries after its fall, the legacy of Songhai is measured not in monuments but in habits. The way markets open, the rhythm of speech between trader and buyer, the preservation of old legal phrases in dusty manuscripts. These are the things that last. Not the crown, not the capital, but the scale, the paper, and the river. So what then does it mean for a kingdom to endure? Is it in the lines of a map, or in the lines of a ledger? In armies remembered, or in taxes forgotten? Or perhaps in the merchant's quiet hands, counting coins of dust and salt still, today along the banks of the Niger? Story 5. The Gold Weavers of Bure, How the Forests Fed an Empire. Before there were kingdoms of gold, there were forests of quiet labor. Before the royal courts of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai minted coins and weighed taxes, men and women in wooded hills and red clay valleys sifted through soil, washing it clean for flakes of precious yellow dust. They lived not in marble cities or caravan capitals, but in scattered clusters of villages hidden in the dense forests of what is now southeastern Guinea. This was Bure, not a kingdom in the traditional sense, not a single capital, but rather a zone of extraction, movement, and quiet importance. From the 9th century onward, Bure's gold fields fed some of the richest empires in West Africa. But the people who mined that gold, the gold weavers, remain largely forgotten. In this story, we walk back into the shade of those forests, and we listen for the subtle rhythm of history written not in war, but in water, mud, and dust. A geography of secrecy. The Bure goldfields lie just south of the upper reaches of the Niger River, along the borders of modern Guinea and Mali. Unlike the well-traveled Sahelian trade routes of Songhai or the cosmopolitan riverbanks of Mali's capitals, Bure was inward-facing, geographically secluded, with thick tree cover, seasonal rainfall, and irregular paths. Caravans could not move freely here. Heavy carts got bogged down, horses sickened in the humidity. Even camels, the backbone of desert trade, had no place here. But the forests hid something worth the hardship: gold dust washed from ancient rock, filtered by rain and buried just below the surface. Villagers didn't need to dig deep mines or blast through stone. Instead, they practiced surface panning and seasonal pit digging, techniques passed through generations. Gold, for them, was not a symbol of opulence. It was currency, obligation, and survival. How the gold was gathered. The methods were simple, repetitive, and extraordinarily effective. Men would dig shallow pits in the red earth, often just a few meters deep. They'd pull up bucket after bucket of soil, carrying it to nearby stream beds. There, women and children would kneel at the banks, scooping the soil into wooden bowls, swirling it in water, and watching as the lighter particles washed away. What remained was heavier, darker, and if one was lucky, flecked with gold. Not nuggets, not coins, but dust so fine it clung to the fingers, coated the bottom of bowls, and had to be scraped gently into cloth pouches. Sometimes the work took days before a single speck appeared. Sometimes a family could gather enough in a week to buy a new cooking pot or pay tribute to a local chief. Gold was measured by sight and instinct. There were no scales, only practiced eyes, and small counters made of iron or stone. It was not glamorous work. It was muddy, slow, and repetitive. But it was the foundation upon which great empires stood. A network of villages. Unlike the cities of Sahelian empires, Bure's settlements were decentralized. No single king ruled the region. Local elders governed clusters of households. Decisions were made communally, with each village managing its own work cycles, tribute systems, and trade partnerships. The region's political strength came not from war, but from its control over access. Foreigners, especially merchants from the north, could not simply walk into Bure. They needed permission, local guides, and often had to trade through intermediaries based in border towns like Kangaba or Kurausa. This insulation gave Bure an unusual power. It could limit the flow of gold, regulating how much left the region and to whom it was sold. In doing so, these forest villages quietly influenced global markets. Forest gold and the rise of Ghana. By the 9th century, the Kingdom of Ghana, located further north in present-day Mauritania, and Mali had grown rich as a broker of trade. It controlled key Saharan routes and taxed caravans moving salt, cloth, and livestock. But the true engine of Ghana's prosperity: gold from Bure. The people of Ghana did not mine this gold themselves. They taxed it. Merchants would travel southward to Wangara towns near Bure's border such as Bambuk and Belejigu, where they exchanged salt from Tagheza, copper from Takeda, and textiles from North Africa for gold dust. The gold was then carried north, taxed at Ghanaian checkpoints, and sold in massive markets like Odeghust and Sijilmassa, eventually reaching Fez, Cairo, and beyond. Thus, gold mined by a family in a muddy pit in Bure could end up in the hands of an Italian banker or an Abbasid caliph. And yet, those who mined it remained unnamed in history, their toil recorded only in the trade volumes of others. The silent power of the gold weavers. There is a reason we might call them gold weavers, though they did not weave cloth. What they did was transform base matter into value, labor into influence, mud into coin. Through repetitive, uncelebrated work, they crafted the economic lifeblood of 3 successive empires: Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. They taught their children when to dig, how to pan, which hills yielded better soil. They passed on songs sung during labor. They buried their tools under trees between seasons. And they remembered who came, who bought, and who tried to cheat. In a world that often glorifies conquerors, the Bure gold workers were quiet rulers with no thrones, but with a resource that drew thrones toward them. A fragile balance. But this economic power came with tension. Overmining could exhaust a pit. Rival villages sometimes clashed over access. Regional chiefs imposed tribute obligations, demanding a portion of each season's yield. And outside empires like Mali sought ever tighter control over the flow of gold. At times, the people of Bure resisted imperial overreach, closing roads or shifting mining sites deeper into the forest. They never formed a kingdom of their own, but their autonomy was defended in the shadows through negotiation, alliance, and sometimes deliberate silence. Let them not know, elders reportedly told younger miners. Let them buy but not find. And so, Bure became a myth to outsiders, described in vague terms, mapped inconsistently, but always whispered about as the source of gold. Even Ibn Battuta, the famed Moroccan traveler, never made it to Bure. He only heard of it. It was a place of wealth not seen, but felt. And yet, what happens to a region whose wealth is always leaving? What does it mean to mine value for others, and never see it return as protection, education, or legacy? How long can a forest endure when its soil is scraped and its rivers are sifted for dust? In the 13th century, a new empire rose to inherit the wealth of Ghana and eclipse it in power. The Mali Empire, founded by the legendary Sundiata Keita. Unlike Ghana, which merely taxed the gold trade, Mali's rulers sought something more ambitious: control of the sources themselves. And so, inevitably, Mali came to Bure. For the gold weavers of the forest, This shift was quiet at first, less a clash than a slow closing in, like vines twisting toward the trees. Armies did not march. Not yet. Instead, tax collectors arrived, then emissaries. Then came chiefs bearing royal titles, and northern scribes with scrolls in Arabic, offering record-keeping in exchange for tribute. The gold dust of Bure would no longer just feed empires, it would now be claimed by one. Mali's expansion. The rise of the Mali Empire was swift and deliberate. By the mid-13th century, Sundiata Keita had defeated the Sasso king, Sumanguru, and united much of the western Sahel under a single banner. But he and his successors knew that lasting wealth came not from cattle, or even from trade routes alone. It came from the source of gold. And Bure, tucked in the forested highlands, was one of the most reliable gold-producing zones in the region. Under rulers like Mansa Uli and later Mansa Musa, Mali gradually absorbed the Wangara trade networks and tightened its grip on Bure. This was not a violent annexation. It was something slower, bureaucratic, and in some ways more enduring. Mali offered protection but required compliance. It funded roads but insisted on tribute in gold dust. It brought scholars but also tax agents. And in the villages of Bure, mining continued. The economy of dust. In Mali's system, gold was not minted into coins. Instead, it was weighed in dust, carried in leather pouches sealed with wax, measured by standard iron weights kept by royal inspectors, and recorded often in Arabic by scribes stationed in border towns. Mali rulers allowed local miners to keep a portion for themselves, but required the rest as imperial tax. This gave rise to a dual economy, one in which gold was used locally to buy goods, settle debts, and pay for rituals, and another in which large quantities were transported north, eventually feeding the markets of Timbuktu, Walata, and even as far as Cairo. Gold became the connective tissue of empire. But for the weavers of that gold, those in the pits and streams of Bure, the weight of empire was sometimes too much. Resistance by obscurity. While Mali claimed sovereignty, the forest villagers remained masters of their terrain. When tribute became too burdensome, some mining communities would disappear deeper into the woods, abandoning pits and starting new ones in harder-to-reach valleys. Merchants unfamiliar with the terrain were dependent on local guides, who might steer them toward or away from productive sites based on informal deals. In some cases, entire villages coordinated to slow the flow of gold, using secrecy as leverage. They had no standing army, no castles or courts, but they had intimate knowledge of the land, and the power of that knowledge was a subtle kind of defense. Mali's power was real, but it was incomplete. The Musa moment. In 1324, Mali's most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, undertook his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca. He traveled with a caravan so vast and carried so much gold that it disrupted economies across North Africa and the Middle East. Contemporary accounts claimed he brought 60,000 men, 12,000 slaves, and so much gold that he caused inflation in Cairo. While the numbers may be exaggerated, the message was clear. Mali was rich, astoundingly so. But the gold that funded this spectacle, much of it came from Bure. Dust washed in forest streams found its way into pouches. Those pouches into caravans, and eventually into the hands of Egyptian merchants. In this way, the forest labor of unnamed men and women in Bure became part of a global event, its origins unspoken, but essential. They remained invisible, but the world saw their work. Timbuktu and the trade arteries. Under Mali, cities like Timbuktu became global centers of learning and commerce. Arabic manuscripts flourished. Mosques stood tall. Scholars gathered in courtyards to discuss theology, astronomy, and law. But all this depended on wealth. And the wealth depended on trade. And trade depended silently, persistently on Bure's gold fields. The irony was sharp. In Timbuktu, gold funded books. In Bure, it funded tools, rice, and cloth. The weavers did not read the manuscripts their gold enabled. They did not travel with the caravans. They did not sit in the legal councils their dust supported. And yet, without them, none of it could have existed. Decline and the forest's endurance. By the late 14th century, Mali's hold on its territories began to weaken. Internal rebellions, rival claimants to the throne, and pressure from emerging powers like Songhai eroded central control. In Bure, this meant a loosening of tribute chains, a return of more autonomy, and a shift in trade networks toward new brokers. The gold was still there, but Mali's ability to count it, weigh it, or claim it diminished. And as the empire faded, Bure remained. The trees kept growing. The streams kept running. The villagers kept mining. Gold continued to be sifted from soil, perhaps in smaller amounts, perhaps more secretly, but always steadily. Because gold, for them, was not about kings. It was about continuity. But what happens when the world moves on from dust? When empires crumble and the roads they built vanish under vines? What remains when gold is no longer a gift, but a burden? And how do the weavers of value survive when the world forgets their hands? By the 16th century, the great empires that once vied for Bure's gold had begun to fade. Ghana was a memory. Mali had fractured. Songhai would soon crumble under Moroccan muskets. But in Bure, along quiet forest streams, the work continued. Gold, after all, doesn't vanish with kings. The pits were still dug. The bowls still swirled in muddy water. Children still learned to watch for the glint of yellow dust in the pan. Though the world turned its attention elsewhere to coastal ports and Atlantic ships, the gold weavers of Bure remained where they had always been, in the forest, kneeling beside rivers, whispering to the soil. The Atlantic shift. Beginning in the 15th century, new forces arrived along West Africa's coastlines. First came the Portuguese, seeking direct access to gold and bypassing the overland Saharan trade. Then came the Spanish, Dutch, English, and French, establishing forts and trading posts along the Gulf of Guinea. This new era defined by ships, not camels, shifted trade from north-south to east-west, and from caravans to cargo holds. Gold remained important, but it was now entangled in different systems. Used to buy enslaved people, traded for European goods, and increasingly tied to coastal economies. Bure, landlocked and forested, became less central, but not irrelevant. New traders, old roots. While the Atlantic economy blossomed, Wangara merchants, descendants of centuries of forest gold traders, continued to operate inland networks. These merchants became key intermediaries between the coast and interior, often traveling from forest zones like Bure to towns in the Savannah and Sahel. They adapted, trading not just gold, but also kola nuts, ivory, and cloth, navigating both Muslim and traditional spiritual networks, building secretive merchant brotherhoods, many of which operated with a remarkable level of discretion. The gold weavers of Bure now sold to different buyers, through different brokers, for different purposes. But the work, the act of mining, panning, gathering, remained largely unchanged. Where empires and economies changed, the rhythm of hands in the soil did not. The hidden cost. There's a silence in the story of Bure, a historical quietness that often accompanies resource frontiers. Gold made empires rich. It funded mosques, libraries, and palaces. It shaped diplomacy and drew maps. But for those who mined it, life was rarely marked by that same richness. Accounts from later centuries describe grueling labor, exposure to disease, and a lifetime spent in proximity to wealth that never stayed. In many villages, gold was both a blessing and a curse, drawing outside interest, bringing tribute demands, and sometimes provoking conflict between communities. Families buried gold tools with care. Some left charms at the mouths of pits. Others developed ritual practices to cool the gold before selling it, ensuring that its spiritual heat would not follow them. Even in profit, there was caution. Even in wealth, there was risk. Oral histories and cultural memory. Today, written records of Buer's internal life remain scarce. But among descendant communities in Guinea, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire, oral traditions persist. Elders speak of ancestors who listened to the ground, villages that vanished to protect their minds, and rivers that remembered gold and forgot kings. In these stories, gold is not a commodity. It's a character alive, temperamental, requiring respect. Some say that when too much was taken too quickly, the earth stopped giving. That certain hills became silent. That certain streams grew cloudy and never cleared. Whether literal or symbolic, these tales echo a truth. Extraction has a cost, and even prosperity wears thin with time. Rediscovery and modern legacies. In the 20th century, French colonial authorities eager to map mineral wealth surveyed much of the Buer region. They found remnants, abandoned pits still visible beneath dense vegetation, old tools made of stone and later iron, dusty ridges where ancient panning had changed the landscape itself. But by then, much of Buer's economic centrality had passed. The gold rushes of modern Africa now drew miners to places like South Africa, Ghana's coast, and Sudan. Buer remained rural, overlooked, but never forgotten. In recent years, small-scale gold mining has returned, though often unregulated and environmentally precarious. The rhythm of panning continues. The bowls swirl once more. And somewhere, perhaps, a child still learns to listen to the river. Reflection, empires held in dust. The gold weavers of Buer never built monuments. They did not write laws, conquer neighbors, or mint coins in their name. Yet they shaped the economies of three empires: Ghana, Mali, and Songhai through repetitive, physical, deeply skilled labor. Their work was hidden in the foundations of cities far away. Their dust gilded the histories of kings they never saw. Their rivers shaped the destinies of entire regions. They remind us that history is not only written in battles or borders. It is also whispered in water, traced in soil, and measured in dust. And perhaps more than anything, they ask us to see value not just in the gold itself, but in the hands that reveal it. Story 6. The Canoe Builders of the Niger: How Wood Shaped a River Empire. Before the camel trains, before the kingdoms of iron and gold, before written accounts were etched by Arab scribes, there were canoes and the river. The Niger River, a broad, winding arc through West Africa, was not only a waterway. It was a lifeline, a place of fishing, bathing, planting, ferrying, and speaking. It bent like a whisper across savannas, threaded through forests, and coiled past rocky escarpments. And along its banks lived the people of the canoe. They were not empire builders in the traditional sense. They built no castles, raised no flags. But they shaped history through something simpler, more vital: wood, water, and the art of moving across both. This is the story of the canoe builders of the Niger River, how they crafted the vessels that carried merchants, warriors, priests, and kings. And how, through quiet labor in shaded boatyards, they changed the shape of power in West Africa. The Niger River's ancient pulse. The Niger is a paradoxical river. It flows northeast, toward the Sahara, before making a sharp inland delta, turn and heading southeast toward the Atlantic. Along this winding journey it passes arid zones near Timbuktu, floodplains around Mopti, fertile valleys in Gao, and finally, thick vegetation in Nigeria. For millennia, communities lived along its banks, not just beside it, but through it. It offered fish, especially the bony, silver tilapia and catfish of the inner delta. Transport when overland travel was hindered by desert, forest, or terrain. And connection, binding regions that otherwise had little cause to interact. But the river's gifts were not automatic. To truly use the Niger to fish it, cross it, and trade upon it, people needed one thing above all: boats. And that meant someone had to build them. The first canoe makers. Historians and archaeologists estimate that dugout canoes made by hollowing out tree trunks have been in use in West Africa for at least 2,000 years, likely much longer. In the absence of stone or metal shipwrecks, the evidence survives in oral histories, wood fragments, and in the rituals of canoe making still observed today. The earliest builders were riverine forest dwellers, especially in the Middle Niger Valley, where tall hardwood trees like mahogany, iroko, and sapele grew. The work was intense, methodical, and deeply spiritual. First, a tree had to be chosen not just for its size, but its character. Prayers or offerings were often made before felling. Then began the long process of carving, hollowing, and smoothing the trunk into a form, both sturdy and flexible. No nails, no planks, just wood, fire, and patience. Some canoes were small, designed for 1 or 2 fishermen. Others stretched over 30 feet, used to carry entire families or dozens of trade bundles. In a world without bridges, these were floating roads. And those who built them, they were not just carpenters. They were technologists, artists, and custodians of a craft that moved civilizations. Canoes and community. The canoe builders lived in close-knit communities, often located on islands or river bends, places where boat traffic was constant and trees were abundant. Their knowledge passed through generations, from father to son, uncle to nephew, or master to apprentice. They learned which woods resisted water rot, how to balance a canoe so it would not tip when fully loaded, how to heat the wood just enough to bend its sides outward without cracking it. The work was slow. A single medium canoe could take weeks. Larger ones might require a small crew and several months, depending on the season. But when complete, a well-built canoe could last decades. It might carry fish from deep-water nets to village markets, salt from Saharan mines to forest zones, or even tribute gold dust, grain, and textiles from provincial towns to royal capitals. Canoes allowed people to live farther apart but remain connected. They allowed survival during famines, when food had to be moved swiftly. And during wars, they became floating arsenals, delivering fighters and retreating families. Every canoe, in this sense, was more than a tool. It was a vessel of resilience. The boatmen of empire. By the time the Mali Empire reached its peak in the 14th century, its reach extended from the Atlantic coast deep into the interior, and the river became central to its infrastructure. Mali used canoes to move tax collectors between towns, transport goods from outposts like Jen and Timbuktu, ferry royal emissaries, judges, and religious figures. In fact, some of Mali's cities, like Niamey, were inland ports, with docks where royal canoes could disembark. There is reason to believe that even Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage to Mecca began, in part, with a flotilla of canoes carrying goods down the Niger to begin his long overland and maritime route. And in later empires like Songhai, river warfare became common. Songhai kings maintained canoe fleets, used for surprise raids, defense of riverine towns, and tax enforcement. These war canoes were often built long and sleek, painted with clan markings, and crewed by skilled oarsmen and archers. Once again, behind every fleet was a community of builders, whose quiet labor made strategy possible. Rituals of the river. The act of building a canoe was never just technical. It was ritual. Among many riverine societies such as the Bozo, Samono, and Sorco, canoe carving involved. Ceremonial songs, often sung during key carving stages. Blessings of the tree, sometimes involving libations of millet beer. And offerings to river spirits, believed to dwell in deep eddies and hidden coves. Some believed that a canoe must have a spirit eye, a notch or hole carved near the prow to allow the boat to see danger ahead. Others used symbolic carvings to mark ownership, clan lineage, or prayers for safe travel. These practices varied from region to region, but they shared a belief that the river was alive, and to move upon it safely, one must show respect. The fade of the forest builders. As the centuries passed and empires fell, the world of canoe builders shifted. The arrival of Europeans in the coastal regions introduced new materials: iron nails, saws, and eventually metal-hulled ships. Later, colonial regimes favored roads and railways, shifting infrastructure away from rivers. But in many inland areas, especially near Mopti, Segu, and Timbuktu, canoes remained essential well into the 20th century. Even today, in parts of Mali and Niger, wooden boats are still carved by hand, using tools and methods that have barely changed. And along the banks, stories remain. Old men sit near canoe skeletons, recalling floods that swallowed docks, raids that came by night, and the day they first learned to hold an adze and listen to the grain of wood. The builders still speak to the river, and sometimes it speaks back. But what becomes of a tradition when the trees grow scarce? When synthetic boats replace carved ones, and fewer apprentices learn the art? Can a river remember its boats, even when they're no longer made by hand? And can history ever honor those whose legacy was built not of stone, but of timber, water, and silence? As the Niger River twisted across the Sahel, so too did the fate of those who depended on it. By the 15th century, as Mali's power waned and Songhai's strength grew, the canoe builders remained quietly essential. No proclamation declared it. No court scribe inscribed their names. Yet the growth of cities like Gao, Kabara, and Jen was carried on the backs of boats and the men who built them. In a land where roads were scarce and sand swallowed trails, the river became the empire's beating artery, and the canoe its vessel of survival. Let us now follow that artery further, not just through water, but through power, resistance, and adaptation. Gao's canoe corridors. Gao, on the eastern bend of the Niger, became Songhai's imperial capital in the 15th and 16th centuries. It was strategically located east of the inner delta floodplains, west of Lake Debo, and along a stretch of river that remained navigable year-round. Trade from across the empire flowed through Gao. Gold from Bure and Lobai country, salt from Tagheza, grain from the floodplains, and slaves, tragically, from raids in the forest fringes. Canoes transported these goods efficiently and in bulk, navigating both main channels and shallow distributaries. Gao had docks, markets, and even warehouses built to receive river cargo. Canoes weren't a convenience, they were infrastructure. Every shipment, every tax, every royal gift that arrived by river had first been cut from a forest, carved by hands, and pushed through water by paddles. The guilds of the river. By this time, canoe building had become more formalized. In many river towns, canoe builders began to organize into semi-formal guilds or castes depending on local customs. In places like Timbuktu and Gengino, builders were known by specific family names or roles, often passed down across generations. These builders controlled access to key trees, often forming agreements with forest communities, employed specialized tools, adzes, wedges, fire burners, and smoothing stones, maintained workshops near water, where boats could be tested and floated. Importantly, their status varied. Some were seen as respected artisans, critical to city life. Others were marginalized, viewed as casted laborers necessary, but excluded from elite society. Yet without them, the river would have been unusable. Their quiet position at the edge of power gave them a strange strength. They were everywhere, yet rarely seen. Canoe warfare and the Sorko fleets. Songhai's rulers, especially Sani Ali, R 1464-1492, invested heavily in river-based military power. The Sorko people, an ethnic group native to the river valley, became Songhai's naval engineers and pilots. Under Sani Ali, they created a fleet of war canoes, long and narrow, crewed by warriors armed with spears, arrows, and at times, even early muskets from North African trade. These war canoes carried dozens of fighters, could be hidden along riverbanks for ambush, and moved faster than overland infantry. In the conquest of Timbuktu and Jen, Sorko fleets padded silently across the water at dawn, landing troops on muddy banks and cutting off enemy retreats. Behind these war efforts were the builders, selecting Iroko logs thick enough to survive battle, shaping hulls for balance under weight, and designing storage for food, arrows, and even drums of signalmen. Though Songhai's empire was vast, its success was carried by canoes, and its canoes were crafted in the shade by calloused hands. Commerce and the canoe network. Beyond war, the canoe served more peaceful but equally powerful roles. Merchants relied on them for long-distance trade. Fishermen used them to reach deep-water nets. Farmers ferried sheaves of rice and millet from flooded fields to village storehouses. One overlooked detail: canoes enabled floodplain agriculture. In the inner Niger Delta, farmers adapted to annual floods by planting crops on rising or falling floodwaters, timing harvests with river pulse, and using canoes to distribute seed, collect harvest, and manage fields too wet for walking. Without boats, these fields would be idle. With boats, they became high-yield zones, feeding not just local communities but whole cities. Every bag of rice, every basket of onions, had likely touched a wooden hull. The builders' challenges. While the builders thrived in their craft, challenges grew. Deforestation. Canoe-grade trees became harder to find. Builders had to travel further or pay higher prices for logs. Political shifts. As empires centralized power, builders were sometimes pressed into service, forced to craft war canoes under duress, or to abandon local work for imperial fleets. Competition. As cities grew, urban merchants tried to control boat trade, sometimes undercutting traditional builders or buying up riverfront space. Spiritual risk. Many believed that improper handling of wood could anger river spirits, leading to capsized boats or drowned passengers. Builders bore the blame if a boat failed. Despite this, most persisted. They passed down knowledge with care, often through oral formulas like, "Cut with the grain, but only where the moon permits." The hull must smile, not frown. Let the canoe sit in water before it carries the living. Their world was one of subtlety, of knowing when wood was ready, when water was safe, and when silence was better than song. Songs of the paddle. Though builders rarely wrote, their influence entered the region's music and poetry. Travelers in the 16th century recorded river songs sung by paddlers, praises to builders for steady hulls, laments about long voyages, and rhythms timed to paddling strokes. In some traditions, canoes were named, almost as living beings. River's child, dust of the sun, or the one who returns. These names weren't decorative. They were protective, intended to guard against misfortune. The canoe, once launched, was part of the family. And the builder, the silent ancestor, embedded in wood. But how long can such a craft endure? What happens when cities forget the source of their goods? When railways arrive and rivers grow quiet? When metal replaces wood and engines outpace oars? Can the old ways remain afloat in the current of progress? By the 19th century, the sounds of West Africa's rivers had begun to change. Where once the creak of wooden canoes and the splash of paddles echoed across calm bends of the Niger, new noises arrived: the thump of steamboats, the whistle of iron engines, the clamor of colonial expeditions. The old river highways, once ruled by handmade canoes, were recharted by foreign surveyors, crisscrossed by new priorities. And quietly, often unnoticed, the world of the canoe builders began to shrink. Not all at once, not everywhere, but steadily. Let us now drift gently through this final stretch of their story, not just through water, but through memory, persistence, and the soft fatting of a tradition that once held an empire afloat. The coming of steam. The late 19th century marked the advent of colonial infrastructure projects. The French and British, both seeking to assert dominance over the Niger River basin, launched military campaigns and river mapping expeditions. With them came imported steamboats, which could travel faster and farther than wooden canoes. New trade routes, shifting control from local merchant guilds to European companies. And an influx of foreign goods, including aluminum boats, iron nails, and sawed planks. To colonial eyes, the traditional dugout canoe seemed crude, labor-intensive, and symbolic of a primitive past they aimed to erase. And so, the quiet boatyards that once buzzed with adzes and chants fell silent. Some builders adapted, working as repairmen for steamboat engines, or crafting hybrid vessels with imported tools. Others refused, retreating deeper upriver, where the forest still whispered to those who knew how to listen. But even for the most skilled, the change was irreversible. The river had not changed, but the world around it had. The colonial cut. Colonial authorities, eager to extract more rubber, gold, timber, and labor, placed increasing controls on river access. In many areas, forests were designated as state property. Logging permits required taxes that builders couldn't afford. And boat traffic became regulated by colonial patrols, restricting the movement of those who once moved freely. In the French Soudan, modern-day Mali, canoe builders who had once been respected artisans were now seen as minor laborers. Their craft, once a pillar of trade and tradition, was marginalized, seen as a curiosity or, worse, an obstacle to modern progress. The songs of the river grew quieter, but not silent. Survival in the floodplains. In places like the inner Niger Delta, where annual floods still made roads unreliable, canoes remained essential. Here, local communities Bozo, Simono, Marca maintained traditions, continuing to carve boats from Morocco and Sapili, holding river festivals where boats were raced, judged, and blessed, and teaching children how to balance a paddle before they learned to walk alone. Canoe builders in these areas survived by crafting smaller, lighter boats for family use, repairing older hulls passed down through generations, and occasionally building for colonial administrators who required transport into flood-prone areas. While their role diminished, their presence never disappeared. The river, after all, could not forget them, and neither could the people who relied on it. Modern echoes. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, some canoe-building traditions experienced revivals. In Mali and Niger, artisanal boat builders began to supply local fisheries again. NGOs promoting sustainable transport funded canoe workshops to reduce dependence on fossil fuels. And in some cultural preservation projects, elder builders were recorded sharing their techniques and songs. Younger generations, though fewer, still learned by watching. How to select a log. How to hear the hollowness beneath the bark. How to make a canoe smile so it would glide, not fight the current. Even in a changing world, the craft remains alive in pockets, especially where canoes are still the only way to reach a neighboring village during flood season. The boat builders are fewer, the trees harder to find, but the skill survives. Quietly, patiently, like a canoe waiting for the river to rise. Reflections in the water. The story of the canoe builders is not one of conquests or revolutions. It is a story of continuity, of small adaptations, long silences, and slow change. They did not write the histories, but they carried the historians. They did not lead armies, but they ferried warriors across floodplains. They did not build palaces, but their boats carried the bricks. In the calm rhythm of their paddles, entire civilizations found movement. And in their boatyards, the shape of West African trade, survival, and spirituality was carved again and again from living trees into living vessels. Lessons carried downstream. Today, as global conversations turn towards sustainability, climate resilience, and indigenous knowledge, the canoe builders of the Niger offer quiet wisdom. That mobility doesn't always mean speed. That infrastructure can be made of wood and water, not just concrete and steel. That technology includes the body, the tree, and the tide. They remind us that some of the most important tools in human history were not complex machines, but simple shapes made well. And that for many communities across the globe, progress isn't always a leap sometimes. It's a gentle push against the current. The canoe builders are still here, if you know where to look. On islands that flood each year. In villages only reached by paddle. In memories passed down not through books, but through motion. Their tools are old. Their craft is slow. But their legacy still floats quiet, essential, enduring.